Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jonathan Elkind. I am a fellow with the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia University. We are very pleased to have you join us this evening for our program on energy, the economy, and geopolitics in the Gulf Arab states. Don't worry, this will not be a speaking from the podium kind of an evening. On the contrary, it will be, we hope, a very lively and interactive discussion among a superb panel that you see seated before you here. One cannot miss the utter centrality of the Gulf Arab states to the history, the present, and the future of the global energy industry. For decades and decades, decisions made in the Gulf, and sometimes decisions made about the Gulf, influenced profoundly the course of energy development around the globe. It's therefore worthy of note that we are witnessing a time of new policy departures, challenging dynamics, and potentially great change in the Gulf Arab states. New energy relationships, new economic programs, new technologies, domestic diversification programs in energy and the broader economy, and geopolitical influences are all making themselves felt in everyday lives. We are thus extremely pleased to be able to offer to you this evening a panel discussion with a simply outstanding panel of visitors. They are, from the near side, Dr. Matar al-Neyadi, Undersecretary at the United Arab Emirates Ministry of Energy, Dr. Adnan Shihab al-Din from the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Science, Nabil al-Kuwaiter, Senior Advisor to the Saudi Ministry of Energy, Industry, and Mineral Resources, Dr. Halima Croft from RBC Capital Markets, and last but not least, Dr. Bernard Haeckel of Princeton University. So let me take a second and just do introductions a little bit more by their background, and then we will have kick off this panel discussion for this evening. Dr. Matar al-Neyadi, as I mentioned, is Undersecretary at the UAE Ministry of Energy and holds a PhD in international law from the University of Edinburgh. Has deep professional experience in leadership, international cooperation, international maritime law, management of international negotiations, climate change, the usage of energy and water, and many other important topics. Dr. Adnan Shihab al-Din is currently the Director General of the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences. He served formerly as the Acting Secretary General and Director of Research at the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. He also serves as advisor to and member of the Kuwait National Nuclear Energy Committee, energy advisor to Schlumberger Business Consulting, board member to Aldora Oil Services, and a number of other important posts. Nabil al-Kuwaiter served previously as the Chief Executive Officer of Saudi Aramco Energy Ventures, and before that held a variety of executive roles, including that of Managing Director of the Aramco Entrepreneurship Center, Director of Collaboration at CAPSARC, and a number of other posts. Dr. Halima Croft joined RBC Capital Markets from Barclays Capital. She also served before that, worked before that at Lehman, and in positions in the U.S. government in our intelligence community. Dr. Bernie Haeckel, as I mentioned, in addition to being a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, also serves as director of the Trans-Regional Institute for the Study of the Middle East and North Africa. So it is truly a pleasure to welcome them this evening, and I would ask you to join me in a round of welcome to them. So let's switch formats a little bit to that of more of a panel. And it is particularly a pleasure to have this kind of intellectual firepower before you today. Just to start off, I'd like to invite the panelists in this order to offer a couple of framing remarks each, maybe 3-4 minutes, about the major developments that they see in global energy markets and in the energy sector within the Gulf region, the Gulf Arab states. So, Dr. Matar, if you wouldn't mind, why don't you kick off for us, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. First of all, I would like to thank the University of Columbia for inviting me to participate in this important, distinguished panel. I am almost 50 years now. And since I am in the last 50 years, everything is coming from our part of the world is a bad news. Some is real bad news, sometimes it's being exaggerated. But all this news is coming from our part of the world, is contributing to create one image that is no successful story in our part of the world. But let me share with you today some sort of element of a great effort, a successful story that is coming from our part of the world. And I will limit my talk on the energy sectors. And I would like to touch upon 4 elements that is we're really proud of it in our part of the world. First of all, energy mix. Energy mix is becoming in the Middle East, in the Gulf region, is a reality. You will take it from all different reasons, either security of supply, environmental, but energy mix now become a reality. There is no elimination to any source of energy. All energy mix, all energy source is welcomed, and all energy is become an integrated part of our economy. And I will come back to that during the question. The second element that is, we are proud of it, and we feel that our part of the world is contributing, is back of the energy of nuclear energy. In the last decade, there was no new project in nuclear energy in the world. Now we see the latest nuclear energy project is in the UAE. That project is helping to keep the momentum and the R&D in the energy and attracting more talent to the energy sectors. Nuclear is not a source of energy only. Nuclear energy is contributing to the economy, helping to create jobs, helping to reduce emission, and to contribute to the security of supply. The third success story which I would like to share is the changing model of exporting energy. We used to export oil and gas. Now the new trend is to export or to import electricity. This is a new business model that has been also become more and more acceptable in our part of the world and helping to create more integration between different countries. And I would like to cite the example of the Gulf cooperation, where we have the interconnection that is connecting from Kuwait to Oman, connecting 6 countries. Since 2009, this project is in operation, helping to prevent blackout. Almost 1,300 cases has been prevented since this project in operation. The 4 elements that which I will be proud of it is the new technology. Energy sector in the Gulf has become more attract to new technology to make the sector more resilient, more sustainable. And I would like also to cite the example of carbon capture. Carbon capture and utilization is is helping and contributing to make the fossil fuel more friendly and more sustainable, and more friendly, more sustainable. This four element, which is only linked to the energy sector, bring to from our part of the world a successful story, a serious effort to make the energy sectors as a sustainable, environmental friendly, and more contributing in diversification of economy. Thank you, Johnson.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Shihab Eldin, your diversity of different positions from OPEC to Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory to CERN certainly must provide a wealth of basis for observations. How do you see this, the news these days on energy in the Gulf Arab states?
Well, let me first reiterate my appreciation for being invited to be with you here today. And let me start by making the observation that globally, there is no doubt that we are in clear transition in terms of global energy mix or global energy system. And the direction of this transition is obviously towards cleaner energies. And that poses a challenge, an opportunity for us in the Gulf countries and in general for oil-producing countries. And I think my colleague have already touched upon the positive initiatives that are being taken by many of the Gulf countries to respond to the challenge of this energy transition. Let me just say that I think the challenges are great, and therefore, not only for our part of the world, but globally. And I think technology is going to be key. I think technology has brought us to where we are here today. We are witnessing the electrification of the global energy system to address many problems, not just simply to make energy cleaner, but also for access, because we still have about 1 billion people in the world who don't have good access to commercial energy. I think the key would be technology in order for us in the Gulf to be able to continue to play a leading role in providing energy, but also how do we respond to the challenge? As you know, the Gulf countries and OPEC countries were the major suppliers for oil. That has been challenged in terms of the dominance of oil is no longer guaranteed. Not only it's no longer guaranteed, it's taken for granted that its role will diminish slowly. The question becomes, in the energy transition, when demand for oil will peak? And we talked about that this morning in another workshop. And nobody has the answer, but I think for us in the Gulf, we must be ready in terms of offering solution at the energy level. This dictates that we have to initiate also energy reforms, pricing, removal of subsidy, which we have started at various sort of speeds in various countries. But that's fine. All of us are taking some measure, but we need to do much more. More importantly, we need also to work on two tracks to respond to the energy transition and the lesser importance for oil and the possibility that we will have a demand peak for oil. We don't know when. We have to work on two tracks. One is to transform our economies to become less dependent on oil on the one hand, but at the same time continue to develop oil and gas resources to benefit from them because they are huge and make them cleaner. And I think my colleague talked about carbon sequestration. I think we should play much more active role in carbon sequestration, not just in the power sector, but even in the transportation sector, whether to make hydrocarbon resources CO2 emission-free, for example, converting them to hydrogen ultimately and capturing the CO2 at the source, or to simply make the use of hydrocarbon resources less emitting, for example, through continuous improvement in internal combustion engine emissions, or in terms of looking for ways and means by which we can benefit from other resources. We have renewable resources, and we started to talk about that. The second challenge, while we're doing that, is how do we make that transition, the economic restructuring? We need to do political and social changes in our part of the world, and that's already starting to happen. I mean, if you looked at the Gulf countries 2-3 years ago, the rest of the Arab world was going through the Arab Spring with all of its conflicts and violence and failures. But 2-3 years ago, the Arab Gulf countries were spared that. But we began to initiate a reform policy, not only in the economic, but I think it's very important that we do that at social and economic. The story is still out, but we need to do much more.
Thank you very much. Nabil Al-Kuwaiter, you have, from your current and previous roles, both with the ministry and with Saudi Aramco, spent a lot of time and attention looking at technology and innovation and where the energy sector is going. I'd be interested in your reflections.
Thank you, Jonathan. And please excuse me, my voice is gone because I've had the nastiest flu I've had probably in 20 years in this today. I think basically it's a technology story. And one of the biggest trends that will come out very clear in the next few years is the growth of solar and renewable energy in the Gulf countries. The last auction, which is a very small one, around 300 megawatts, that was done in Saudi Arabia, came in at one point at 1.7, was it eventually corrected to 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's cheaper than gas, dual cycle gas. And it's going to continue to drop. It has been dropping, and we may see 1 cent per kilowatt hour, which will eliminate all other competition from fossil fuel electricity generation. And not only solar that is photovoltaic, but there's a $3 billion plant in Dubai that's being built now, which is based on using molten salt to store the heat and generate electricity 24 hours. And that project is now currently priced, I believe, at 9 cents per kilowatt hour. But that's eventually going to come down. So we may, in the next 10 to 20 years, eventually see 24-hour renewable energy available in the Gulf region for about the same price as gas or oil. And that's going to be huge. It's going to be huge in more ways than one. It's not just about sparing oil and gas for export or reducing pollution. What it will do is actually having free energy pretty much available will allow the introduction of industries, the desalination of seawater, and the transformation of the local economies. Because free energy essentially means that you can do almost anything you want. So I think from a technology point of view, that's one of the biggest trends. And I think we have another auction in Saudi Arabia coming up for about 1 gigawatt later this year of combination photovoltaic and wind power, or two separate projects, wind power and photovoltaic. And it's probably just going to accelerate the growth. So we might have 10 gigawatts of installed capacities in 5 years. So that's one trend. With regard to Dr. Adnan's comment about peak oil demand, we may be pushing it forward a little bit, because what Aramco has been doing in the recent last few years, it's been working with car manufacturers, multiple car manufacturers around the world, US, Japan, Germany, everywhere, to develop highly efficient engines that are much smaller and double the efficiency of existing engines. And the idea behind this is that these engines will not drive the wheels directly, but will drive a medium-sized battery that will then drive the wheels. And the advantage of this kind of car is several. One is you don't throw away your Tesla car, you keep it. But you just take out this massive expensive battery and you replace it with a smaller battery and a small engine. They're both actually much lighter than the existing battery. And on top of that, it'll not only be cheaper to make, but it'll have 10 times the existing range. So you're talking about the equivalent of having 50 to 60 miles per gallon. So you can go 1,000 miles potential on a tank of gas. Now that sounds like bad news for the oil exporting countries. Because if you fill up your car once a year, once a month, why would you use more gas? The other benefit of this new transition to hybrid cars is the fact that these cars will be so much cheaper than existing cars, both electric and standard ICE, internal combustion engines. These cars will be able to, you can practically stamp most of the parts out because it's largely electronic. You just drop an engine in there. And the engine doesn't have to be large because you could have a battery capable of 400 horsepower when you need it, but with an engine that's only 50 horsepower. So the engine would keep the battery topped up, and when you need the power, you can get it. But just going back to the consumption of oil, what will happen is with cheaper cars, many more of these cars will be sold in developing countries to areas of the world where people could not have afforded cars like that before. So remote areas of Asia and Africa, where farm products are now spoiling because they can't be exported to local markets, and where there's a maldistribution of food, that'll be changed completely. As soon as the poor farmers in the most remote areas can afford a small truck that they only need to fill up once a month, you're going to see a major transformation in the economies of the remote areas. And of course, an increase in consumption because you suddenly have a lot more customers. At least that's the optimistic view. So I'm not sure if you agree with it, but I think that's a very good potential there.
Excellent. Thank you. So, Halima, your three predecessor panel members have kind of looked specifically at what is happening in the Gulf, and I'd be interested if you would do some of the same, but also then put a bit of a broader context on how what is happening in the Gulf relates to what you see happening more broadly in global energy markets.
Well, first of all, I should say thank you for having me on this panel. And it's an honor to be up here with such esteemed panelists. And you mentioned the OPEC background, and I consider myself really an OPEC watcher. And I think one of the very important things that we've seen in the last 2 years is OPEC really getting its groove back. And the sense that this is, OPEC's obituary has been written on multiple occasions, but certainly in 2014, when no decision was made to put a floor in for prices, I think people thought that OPEC was really out of the market management business. And then you fast forward to November of 2016, when the Joint Declaration of Cooperation was announced to pull 1.8 million barrels of the market. There was a lot of skepticism in the market from investors about whether an organization made of Arab countries, African countries, Latin American countries could actually work together. A tremendous credibility challenge faced OPEC with that agreement. And many of the issues were very political. People did not believe you could have an agreement where you had the Saudis and the Iranians agreeing on an oil agreement if there were broader political disputes. There was a question of, would countries that have been traditional cheaters in terms of their quota obligations, would they toe the line? And I think what has been actually remarkable, and one of the most important developments in the oil market in the last year and a half, has been the discipline shown by OPEC in maintaining this cut, and the leadership of certain, key figures like the Saudi oil minister, now the Emirati oil minister is the president of OPEC, really enforcing that discipline. And I think it has changed people's perceptions about this organization. It has played a very important role in the rebalancing process. But there are questions as we go into 2019 in terms of what happens to the market. Does this agreement sunset? will they be able to hold it together in the face of resurgent shale production? So I look at OPEC and I say it's actually been a tremendous success story, but the questions will be, how do they answer issues about what will be the exit, the return of US shale? And I think another really interesting development that I could not have foreseen was the partnership with Russia. And I think this brings up a whole host of interesting strategic questions about Russia's role in the Middle East. I mean, I remember 3 years ago at the OPEC seminar where you had the Russian oil minister, Alexander Novak, on the stage, and he was asked if Russia would ever participate again in a cooperation agreement with OPEC. And Alexander Novak said, not only will we never participate in an OPEC cooperation agreement, I question the relevance of OPEC in the face of US production. I thought, oh my gosh, that's an incredible thing to say at an OPEC-sponsored event. And so to see him sitting on the sort of stage at OPEC, joint delivering the message, to see him walk in with the senior OPEC ministers, I think it's a tremendous sort of signal about how things have changed in the last 2 years. And I think the interesting question is now when we talk about sort of Russia and OPEC continuing some form of cooperation, what will this look like? And what will be the sort of beyond oil, what are the strategic implications of this energy partnership? And this is the last thing I would say is, I think it's on the sort of economic and social reforms, I do think it's so amazing what has actually happened compared to the post-Arab Spring period. If you think about right after Hosni Mubarak was pushed out of power, Gulf states increased their spending to double down on the social bargain. And I don't think it could be anticipated the types of reforms that have actually taken place in the last year. I mean, in terms of subsidy reforms, in terms of social reforms, and the sort of urgency that's been given to this reform effort by the low price environment has in some ways been a silver lining in helping these countries better transition and wean themselves off of dependence on oil.
Thank you very much. And Bernie, last but not least, I mean, our colleagues have commented in particular on the energy dimensions and also on some of the implications for the socio-political developments in the Gulf. I wonder if you, from your background, would care to comment on how you are seeing these trends develop and how are the dynamics in the Gulf Arab states looking to you?
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation. I hope you can all hear me. Here it's like an echo, and I couldn't hear a lot of my colleagues. But in any event, my sense is the following: that if you look at the long history of the last, let's say, 40 or 50 years, there was one major oil boom in the early mid 70s, and a second one in the sort of mid-2000s. And it's very unlikely that there will ever be a third major boom. And that is a reality that has been internalized by the leadership in the Gulf, especially in Saudi Arabia. And I think the transition that Dr. Shahabuddin was speaking about is one that is intensely felt by this leadership. I put it very crudely by saying, to people who often ask me about why is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, why is he in such a hurry? And I often ask the rhetorical question, have you been in a Tesla? And if you have, you will know why he's in a hurry. Clearly, there is a transition happening, and I think that someone like the Crown Prince, but others, will want to monetize as much as possible the oil reserves, because the great fear, which by the way was there also in the 1970s, the great fear of these countries is that there will be an endless amount of oil in the ground that remains unsold, and that that's something that they don't feel comfortable about, and they would like to be able to monetize in order to diversify their economies, in order to better their societies, especially the human capital in their societies, to be able to transition to a diversified economy. And I think that's the great challenge that they face at the moment. And it's the one that is being tackled most sort of aggressively in Saudi Arabia. The other major kind of sort of transformation, which is structural in the region, is a political one. And it's not necessarily tied to energy, but of course, energy prices will affect this political transformation, and that is that we're seeing two major hegemons now forming in the region and competing, and that's Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the Saudis are, in particular, I think, aware that the U.S. is declining in relative terms, that their markets are in the Far East and in South Asia, that they have to carry their own water militarily to defend themselves, which is not something they've either done or had to worry about in the past. So there is a major transformation in terms of building up your internal resources and capacities, political, military, in order to fend for yourself, because it is a very dangerous neighborhood. And that is, I think, something that we are seeing very palpably in the region.
Well, thank you very much. Before we go to our kind of open panel discussion, let me just mention that this event, like all of the center's public events, is being webcast live. Both the full video and a podcast recording will be available on our website and iTunes in the coming days. And for those of you who are watching online, as well as people who are here in the audience, you can submit a question at any time using the hashtag CGEP events. Again, that's CGEP, like Center on Global Energy Policy, events, and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. So we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion here for the next phase of this discussion. And then we will take a few questions from the audience before we conclude. Let me just start, please, with one of the biggest topics that a couple of you have commented on, and that is the OPEC Plus relationship, the agreement on production constraints. I'd be interested for the views of those of you on the panel who wish to comment on this about whether you see the oil market returning to balance, whether you see a permanent relationship involving OPEC and some of the non-OPEC members. I know that Minister Al-Masri has commented on the possibility of that kind of a new structure. So panelists, how durable do you see the OPEC Plus agreement being? How long will it be around? Forever or for only a period of time? Who would kick off?
I could start.
Please, yeah.
I mean, the OPEC Plus agreement is proof to us that all the oil-producing countries will come to the conclusion that they need to work together in the benefit of the oil market. And that invitation even is going to the shale oil company. Why we don't come together to the benefit of the oil market, to the stabilization of the oil market? There's no interest for anybody, to float the market with the oil. There's no interest for oil price to go up or to go down. It's not good for the investment, and we experienced this in the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. So working together, either member of OPEC country or other outside OPEC country, is something that we've been looking for and something that in 2016 managed to achieve. And I think expanding or including non-OPEC member country in some sort of an arrangement is good for the oil market.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Adnan, I wonder if you've certainly thought about this a great deal.
Well, I remember when I was working with OPEC, the question was, should Russia join OPEC? This was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And in fact, the answer to that question was often said, well, OPEC members are developing countries, oil producing and exporting countries. Russia is a different country. Russia is a nuclear weapon state, carries a lot of weight. But if you contrast that with what has happened and the success, it tells you, as my colleague has said, at the end of the day, it's the economics that matters. And when Russia was faced with the challenge with the rest of the producers 2-3 years ago, it was obvious that in an environment of low oil prices, everybody is hurting and everybody has to chip in. And that's how the cooperation comes in. The second point, again...
Do you think that that means now that the market has returned to balance?
Well, it's almost there. It depends how you look at it. There are yellow flags about with prices edging up to 70. We are expecting, and maybe EIA, I think last month, was talking about revising their forecast for shale oil from the United States to come up much more than originally they thought. So there are some yellow flags, and I think that will strengthen the resolution or the resolve of OPEC, Russia, and the consortium to maintain the agreement as long as it takes to continue the stabilization. But we wouldn't be at $65 a barrel if it wasn't that the perception and reality of the market that we are almost there. And not only at this point we are almost there, but the market usually anticipates, and the market was anticipating a balance. The second point I wanted just to say is that, and you alluded to it, is that over time, always proven that economics comes first and politics comes second in the oil market and in OPEC. Remember, we have many episodes during the last 40, 50 years when even countries of OPEC were fighting, and yet decisions were taken about the oil market and they prevailed. That explains why Iran and Saudi Arabia are cooperating, why Iraq and Kuwait 30 years ago almost were party to a same decision or resolution. So at the end of the day, economics really, and usually it happens when the oil market is low. We see much more solidarity and interest in cooperation. When the market is high, when the prices are high, everybody goes on his way because the pressure is less for cooperation.
So Bernie, I'd get your perspective on this. I mean, economics first and politics second in the oil market. Russia certainly in its engagements in the Middle East has had many different stances from many of the Gulf Arab state countries. I'd be interested to know your perspective on that and whether those political differences do or do not ultimately make a difference to this OPEC-Russia arrangement.
Look, I think that there's a personal relationship that exists between President Putin and the Crown Prince of the UAE, as well as the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And we are also in an age where people communicate immediately and directly with one another. They don't go through their foreign ministers necessarily.
Sometimes they use Twitter, I hear.
Yeah, or WhatsApp, or Telegram if you're Russian. So I think we're in a new age as far as not just communications, but also the kinds of connections that people have, and those are important and not to be dismissed. And I think that from my reading of the leadership in the region, in the Gulf region, that they may feel extremely strongly about what's going on in Syria and the role of Russia in Syria, but they can disentangle that from oil policy and what's in the common good of oil producers. Also, there are other factors at play, because Russia is not just about Syria and the region. It's also about its relationship with Iran. It's about what role it could possibly play to help end the war in Yemen. There are any number of issues that on which countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia can see more eye to eye with the Russians than, let's say, on Syria, where there are very clear differences. So my feeling, and if I were a betting person, I would say that the OPEC Plus arrangement is likely to remain, and it's likely to remain in light of the fact that, as shale is a threat to all of them, it's likely to keep them together.
By the way, I'll just repeat to my fellow panelists, you are invited to jump in anywhere, on any topic that you wish. But I'll keep posing questions to you if you don't wish. Let's talk for a minute about the increasing focus on East Asia as a core part of the demand growth that relates to the Gulf Arab states and your production. How does this change the scene in terms of either investment patterns for the Gulf Arab state countries and their national oil companies? How does it change the scene in terms of the political and geopolitical relationships?
Sorry,
Halima, you want to jump in on that, or who would like to start?
Well, it's definitely East Asia is growing at a time when Europe and the U.S. is relatively stagnant when it comes to transportation fuels. And wherever there are opportunities for investment, they're not always as easy as in the West. Certainly, national oil companies, in particular Aramco, have made investments in these countries. But that's, I think, we're still talking about not massive investments for the time being. But on the other hand, these are, as I said, very important areas. They'll continue to grow. The populations, a lot of them are relatively undeveloped economically. And so there's, of course, a much bigger potential for increase in oil demand in these areas than in any other part of the world.
Thank you. Anybody else care to jump in on that question? Please, Dr. Adnan.
Let me talk about the experience of Kuwait, which I know somewhat. Integration has been a key part of Kuwait Oil Strategy, even if you go back to the 70s. So today, we are moving eastward, and we are moving more in terms of trying to get the most out of each barrel that we extract by refining it, by making it cleaner, by finding other uses for oil. So I'm just, it's almost like self-evident that that's what you should do. But if we focus on moving east, as Nabil said, almost all of the Gulf countries have expanded their business investment targeting eastward, whether it is investing in refineries within the region with products shipped to the Far East, or investing in refineries or in storage or what have you. So I think it's almost self-evident that we're going to see much more of that. The key would be to what extent we can keep the demand for oil growing in that part of the world, and we touched upon that earlier, so I'm not going to repeat myself.
I need to shift the discussion a little bit away from oil. I mean, I'm sharing the view of my two colleagues here. But for the relation between the Gulf area and the East Asia, or the East Asia is growing. Take, for example, the UAE nuclear project is being constructed by a Korean company. Last year, a company from Japan and China, they've been awarded a project, 1,000 megawatt solar in Abu Dhabi. Mubadala is investing heavily in some of East Asia. So the relationship between the Gulf and the East Asia is growing, and that has been reflected in high-level visits that's been conducted from UAE and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to that part of the world, reflecting the importance of East Asia and Asia as a continent to the Gulf. Strategic reserve for UAE, for oil, is in Asia. I think Saudi Arabia, they have the same. So that also all indicating that how important East Asia to the Gulf.
Please, go ahead and tell Iman.
I just wanted to take it from a little bit of a different angle. I remember when I started my career in the US government, right after 9/11, we were very focused on security of supply. And part of the, not the main reason, but one of the sort of justifications for the significant US military presence, for example, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, was to help ensure that sea lanes would remain open because we viewed this as a very, very important source of supply for the United States. So it was a national security imperative to protect the security of those key sea lanes. Now, one of the things that was I remember starting to percolate in the discussions with the US energy revolution was, if we are not getting as much oil from the Middle East, and that oil is increasingly going to Asia, what is our overarching imperative to spend so much money on such large, US military assets if we're protecting sea lanes for oil going to Asia? Now, I don't think of that necessarily as the main thrust of the Trump administration policy, but I do think that, as we had these shifting trade patterns, do I envision potentially that whole discussion sort of reemerging, also with the US becoming an exporter and exporting into Asian markets? Will at some point that potentially start to filter through into defense policy questions? If we have finite defense resources, where are we using them?
Okay, that's an important point, and certainly a question that's on the minds of many, and it's one that comes back and back. Let me shift, if I might, to one of the most tricky topics, and a couple of the panelists referred to it, and this is energy reform within the Gulf Arab states. In particular, of course, the sensitivities arise around pricing and subsidies. This is a topic that has been one focused on by a number of your countries. I'd like to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to elaborate a little bit on what expectations there are. Obviously a very tricky topic that is thought about carefully and by decision makers everywhere. How is the progress going in terms of the reform of pricing in the Gulf Arab states? Please.
In UAE, we were being lucky that the price, for example, either we're talking about the gasoline and price or about the electricity and water tariff. For the gasoline price, until 2015, the price was in the UAE was the highest among the region, and that make the decision to be taken is much easy. In July 2015, the government decided to link the gasoline and diesel price to the international market, and since that time up to now, we only witness 4% increase in the gasoline price. The reason why, because at that time the price was high comparing to the regional country. We faced some tough question from the people why we are the only country, a producing oil country, increasing the price, but the decision has been taken, and we've been supported also by the trust the people they have in the government. For the electricity and water tariff, again, that tariff was also high comparing to the regional. And between the time to time, that tariff is being revisited to bring it more and more close to the international market. But up to now, electricity and water tariff is still subsidized, not like the gasoline, but that tariff is being revisited between time to time. Thank you.
Right. Please.
Well, the issue of subsidy and pricing currently must be taken in the broader context of removal of subsidy and rationalizing subsidy. Because subsidy for the past, let's say, 50 years has been in part as a way to distribute the wealth, the rent from oil to the population, and the population has become sort of accustomed to that. So if you're going to remove subsidies, if you're going to do something like that, you have to convince the public that there is a win for them. And so therefore, I think the Emirate has done a great job. And it's sort of like the benchmark. Saudi Arabia is doing very good. We've started in Kuwait and other countries of the Gulf. I think our pace in Kuwait is a bit slower, much slower than the rest, partly because we have a more participatory political system, with the parliament always taking a position, challenging the decision of the government, asking the government to demonstrate why it is doing this. And so we have to look at energy pricing and energy subsidy removals as part of the bigger picture. And that includes, for example, wealth sharing through employment, because a good part of the employment in the Gulf, in part, is to respond to wealth sharing. So, but now we are being challenged by the low energy prices, which is going to be more or less, we're not going to go to the boom years. Therefore, I think the governments are beginning to address that question. How do we encourage the private sector to generate the employment and to shift from the government guaranteed job, regardless whether it's productive or not, to a more productive job in the private sector? And that means we have to educate the public better, or the younger people, and give them opportunities, what have you. And that transition is not easy, but it's taking place.
Right. Bernie, I saw you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, on the issue of subsidies, I mean, I think that a couple of points. First, it's still very early days, so it's very difficult to know if there's really going to be a more sustained political reaction to their removal, or at least the fact that they've diminished significantly. Here I'm thinking about water, electricity, gasoline. Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia, the government has been quite good at doing a couple of things. One is they created something called the Citizens Account, which targets the lower income elements in society to compensate for the increase in prices for utilities. That's one. The other thing that they've done is that they've increased some of the allowances in the public sector employment, and the Saudi government employs 70% of its working population. So that has dampened the effect. But I think going forward, hopefully there will be significant economies and less profligate sort of use of electricity, gasoline, and so on, and water in the country. So all of that is for the good. I think the other point that I wanted to make, which is very worth keeping in mind, is that instead of the private consumer, the other issue is what happens to the subsidies that are offered to the private industry, to the private sector. I mean, here, look at, for instance, the dairy farms in Saudi Arabia, or look at petrochemicals. Now, if they don't get subsidized, energy inputs, they will become a lot less competitive, and their comparative advantage will disappear. And I think that is something that's worth thinking about and keeping in mind.
Well, this provides a good pivot, I think, to another topic that I think is important to draw out, and that is the non-oil economy. And several of you have commented on it, but I'd be interested to try to dig a little bit more deeply into it. How quickly would you see the Gulf Arab states moving to grow the non-oil economies? It is a challenge, certainly in terms of new industries, new supply chains, new trading relationships, new workforce capabilities. What are your expectations? What should the audience expect in terms of the development of the non-oil economies?
I don't want to be at the start.
Okay.
But I will come back to that one.
Halima, why don't you be our sacrificial lamb?
Sure, I'll be the sacrificial lamb. I mean, I think that there are countries that have already made substantial progress along this path, like UAE. I mean, I almost think of them as sort of best in class when we think about who prepared early on for this transition, and you see the benefits. I think that in the case of Saudi Arabia, and I think that they've made, more progress than expected. I mean, I think a lot of us were not thinking they would do this much in terms of subsidy reform. We just thought these are sacred cows. They cannot get their population to agree to this. So, I look at things like the bankruptcy laws. Like those are very important reforms that are taking place. Like inclusion in MSCI will be another big thing for Saudi Arabia. But I think we're just going to have to see. I mean, I think it is slow going to make these transitions in terms of non-oil economy. And there are going to be key questions about, what happens with the public investment fund in Saudi Arabia. I mean, you have these incredible sovereign wealth funds that are developed in other parts of the Gulf. What's going to happen with the public investment fund? How is that going to be used to sort of help generate new jobs domestically? So I think that Saudi's actually done more than expected in terms of the fiscal reforms, but it will be, slower going in terms of, some of the foreign investment and the sort of job creation. And I actually think that's why the social reforms are so important. Because if you're asking citizens to pay more for their upkeep, and the payoff in a private sector job is still potentially a couple years away, I think it is incredibly important that they've been offered, more social freedom. I think it is an important bridge that keeps the population going until you generate those new employment opportunities.
Great, please.
Yeah, in UAE, I think we already started. Diversification of the economy beyond oil is a top priority at the government. We believe in the new technology, and data is the future. The recent reshuffle in the government, they've been appointed a minister for artificial intelligence. Fourth revolution of industry is on the agenda. So I think all public sector is being directed by the cabinet to work and preparing the country for beyond oil. So this is a serious effort is taking place. We just started. We know that we have a lot to do, but the bottom line, we already started in the UAE.
Great. So in just a second, I'm going to invite questions from the audience. There is a microphone stand just over here, and if you are interested to pose a question, which I very much encourage you to be, I'll ask you to come to the microphone and pose your question from there. Let me just, while the brave first people are moving toward the microphone, let me just pose one last question from my side, and that is on the issue of the United States and the shale revolution that has happened here. Obviously, it has had a very important set of impacts in the global market. I would be interested in the reflections, particularly of our visitors from the Gulf Arab states, of how that change in the market is viewed in the kingdom, in Kuwait, and in the UAE.
Well, I think the shale has brought in to the picture a completely new way of thinking within the oil market, because what characterizes the shale industry is that it's very quick to respond to market development, whether it is supply and demand, or whether it is prices. And therefore, this means that OPEC or the Gulf countries, when they are developing their strategy, the one benchmark they have to look always, or one indicator they have to look at, is what's happening in the shale. Are they responding? Are they economizing? That's probably, in my mind, as we move into this new phase, that's good, because it keeps us honest, so to speak. As I said earlier, it's not good for the oil-producing countries to repeat the boom and bust cycles that we passed through, because the boom and bust cycle sort of develops a sort of lack of willingness to address the issue of sustainability, non-oil economy, because even if you are in a bust, you're counting on a boom. Well, that's not the case anymore. The minute that prices go up, we see shale production immediately responding within 6 months or 1 year or what have you. That's the picture. So I think that's what has changed, and that is reflected in the strategies that are being taken by the national oil companies that dominate in the Gulf countries, whether it is Aramco or whether it is NOC. And that means that we have to put more effort, even in the issue of the oil, on technology development. I think we have listened to Nabil talk about some of the pioneering work, and I really commend Aramco for their work on the ICE and others. We really have to invest in any way we can make the oil cleaner, more sustainable, and diversify the use of oil, combining it with carbon sequestration or whatever it is. So I think that's basically, in summary, what I could say to you.
Thank you. Nabil, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the shale oil, I think the best comparison to shale oil today is North Sea oil in the early 80s. They were both driven largely by very high, historically very high prices. And they would not have occurred if it wasn't for the high prices. So the North Sea oil was actually a new technology in of itself. Anyway, at the time, digging or drilling in the cold North Sea waters was considered a big challenge. But once the prices were at the right level, they were able to do it. But now we don't see North Sea oil really significant anymore in the world oil market. And I think the shale oil will eventually go the same way, or at least American shale. On the other hand, when you look at, there are people like hedge fund managers who probably make more than all of us on this panel combined, who are betting on high oil prices for the next 5 years. So based on the opinion of these wise, wealthy people, I would guess that shale oil is not as much of a threat as it appears to be. These guys must know something we don't know. And I leave it to you. Am I correct? I think they're predicting $70 oil over the next 5 years, the speculators.
There's a range of views. Yes, I mean, we see oil at the end of the year, mid-60s, high 60s. We think there are a variety of issues, though, besides shale that are important that we even touched on in this panel. You can have shale returning, but potentially Venezuela going off the cliff as well. So the question of, what are the offsets? Are we looking at the permanent erosion of Venezuelan production capacity based on this, this current crisis? So I think there are a lot of variables. But what I think is fascinating about the shale story is I think it has changed mindsets in the way that you talked about of the leadership, saying that we have an urgency now. I think it's shale and the Tesla to say that, even if shale becomes less important by 2025, we're just not going to take that bet. We're not going to be complacent. We are going to take these urgent, painful, politically controversial reforms because, we don't have a choice. So I do think in some respects, when we look back at this period, if these reforms are successful, if these governments make significant progress in diversification that provide new opportunities for millions of people under the age of 30, the shale revolution may have been a great benefit to these regions.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to open up for questions, and I see our first questioner there. Let me just repeat that those of you who are watching online and those of you who are so inclined here in the audience may submit a question at any time using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. Would you please introduce yourself and pose your question?
I'm Amy Jaffe, and I'm affiliated here with the Columbia program and also a fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. So my question for the panel, and Halima kind of gave a little preview, is in past times in history, if you got something like the collapse of Venezuela's industry, we've had this sort of slow collapse, but it's starting to gain momentum. In past times in history, especially the GCC members within OPEC have, especially because it's heavy crude, have changed their policy when there's been a supply disruption like a Venezuela-style problem. And my question is, if there is a crisis in Venezuela, do you see Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the UAE stepping into the market the way they have in history, or are we now in a different place because of the shale, and that won't happen, and because of the price requirement
So
for
just,
the shale.
we have the pleasure and the pain of being under what I learned today is evidently the largest single granite dome in the United States, or maybe elsewhere as well. But I'll repeat the question because it's kind of hard to hear. The question was, if one were to see Venezuela moving away from the market, a big change and an abrupt change in the market, could one anticipate the Kingdom and Kuwait and UAE stepping in to fill that gap in the way that has been true in the past? Sorry, Amy? And if not, why not? Anyone care to start?
Go ahead.
Please.
I mean, I'm just going to answer based on a rational response, not necessarily what will happen, but my thinking is if you are expecting or hoping that oil prices will stay in the same range or not go too far where they'll ignite maybe new technologies and create more production that's hidden now, then it would make sense for all of the countries, not just Saudi Arabia, Russia, and everybody else to up their production.
Right.
And at the end of the day, it'll be almost insignificant for all the members because it'll be a small bit from every member anyway.
So the key thing you think is to avoid demand destruction, if I might paraphrase it that way.
Yes.
Please.
Please.
No, and I think it's so easy to do it because OPEC and Russia has taken out almost 2 million barrels a day of easy production or easy supply, so that can easily substitute. And I think the self-interest will drive you to do that.
Dr. Matar?
Yeah, I mean, I share that. I don't think that will be major. That will cause any major. I mean, we experienced sometime Libya is being out of the market. Nigeria sometimes is being so. It's not a new phenomenon. If it's happened, I'm sure the market will reply to it.
Very good.
If we don't do that, we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot.
Right. Okay, please. Again, introduce yourself, please, and your question.
Hi, I'm Ellen Wald. I'm a non-resident scholar at the Arabia Foundation. And my question is, we've talked a lot today about economic diversification, social liberalization, even some cultural changes. My question is, to what extent do you see any of these economic changes and social changes as potentially precipitating political change? We've seen a lot of top-down economic and social change, but what about the political issues?
So the question, just to repeat, was whether the economic and social changes that one has been talking about here, could this precipitate political changes? Bernie, I wonder if you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder why that question, much as I like Ellen, and this is not a criticism at all, but, you know, that question is hardly ever asked of China, and they do the same sort of thing. So I think that the leadership, and the leadership that I follow the closest is the one in Saudi Arabia. The changes that are necessary now cannot happen under a situation where you have political liberalization, because you would need to bring on board a number of people to, in effect, disenfranchise themselves or be willing to give up privileges that they don't want to give up. So you have to have a situation where you know, an autocratic decision-making process decides on these changes to happen, and that eventually, if you know, the economy diversifies and jobs get produced and a new social compact is created, then politics can perhaps be discussed. But I don't see that happening anytime soon at all. Just as I don't see it for China, by the way, or Russia.
Okay, please, next question.
Hi, I'm Ripunjay Bansal, a first-year student of MPA program in Energy and Environment at Columbia and SEPA. So I had two real quick questions. So first was that we discussed a lot about like moving away from oil in the Gulf countries, like diversification of the economies. So I was wondering, like, do you think whether the OPEC countries or in the Gulf countries, they would consider having a carbon tax? One. Second was that you talked about a lot of increasing demand of oil in Asia, specifically in Asia Pacific. So in order to probably like have a more stronger relationship, we see a lot of investments by Gulf countries in Asia in terms of refining capacities or transportation or storage. So do you think whether the Gulf countries would open up their upstream sector, especially in E&P, to Asian nations so that they could invest in their E&P, exploration and production resources, so that they are also, they also have a sense of security in terms of oil?
So just to repeat that, one question was about the notion of whether one could see a carbon tax in the Gulf Arab states related to economic diversification and reform. A second, could one foresee the opening of the upstream in the Gulf Arab states to investment from Asian partners where there are downstream positions by the Gulf companies?
I revert to
Please.
the carbon. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we are going to talk about the carbon tax or a carbon market. We used to have CO2 emission is something that you need to pay to get rid of it. Now, with the transformation and the evolving of the energy sector, people is looking for CO2 in a way that if there is a CO2 market, that will incentivize more company to invest in carbon capture and utilization. Maybe there's some measure need to be taken to enable that incentivize of CO2 market, but CO2 now become a commodities, not as a burden for a company to pay a tax for it. So I think the evolving, changing the concept from tax to incentivize as a market. For open the upstream for Asian, for example, if you see taken ADNOC in UAE, there's already a Chinese company that has been allocated part of concession in Abu Dhabi oil sectors. So that is indicating more the level of the relationship is going on between the UAE and some of the Asian countries.
Okay. Please.
I could see a possibility where if CO2 capture and sequestration becomes successful, that you could charge an extra, almost tax or whatever it is, and put a label on whatever hydrocarbon you export. You could say, for this barrel, I have sequestered all of the CO2, and therefore I am marking it up by that much of an amount. But that would require more of a global understanding. One country or one region alone cannot do it. This has been an old idea where they said, you know, you do carbon tax at the source. So for it to work, it would require a much more, first of all, technology development, because you want to use that tax to compensate for the extra cost of cleaning up the oil that you're sending for the end user.
Or if you could label a product, take for example Emirates Steel, where the steel is being manufactured in a factory with zero emission.
Yes, it's the same thing.
So if you incentivize another factories, that will encourage, for example, aluminum to invest more and to install the capture facility. So I think the concept, if we look at it from market and we look into the CO2 as a commodities more than a tax that you will need to punish the source of the CO2.
That's what I meant. It's not a punishment. It's sort of like, that's the value.
Yeah.
This is an added value.
Bernie, please.
Yeah, the second part of the question was about getting Asian countries to invest in the upstream. Yeah. I mean, the Aramco IPO is exactly that. If China or Singapore or whatever country chooses to buy stocks in Aramco, it's effectively buying a portion of that company, which includes the upstream.
Let's go to the next question, please.
Hi there. My name is Michael Dobson. I'm a PhD student in the city, so very much not a hedge fund manager. But I don't share the confidence of those who would say that we're looking at $70 a barrel. It seems to me the combination of the rise of shale and the drive to monetize coming on the back of renewables and Tesla, etc., means we're headed much more towards $10 a barrel than $100 a barrel, absent coordination. And I think that's obviously really concerning from a climate perspective. So it seems to me that even OPEC plus coordination isn't going to be enough, and maybe is it time to be talking about some kind of genuinely multilateral market?
So I'm going to encourage you to bring it to a question, please.
So sorry, is it time to start talking about a genuinely multilateral system of fossil fuel supply, coordination and constraint and management?
So the question, as I understood it, is whether it is time to talk about a genuinely multilateral system for coordinating supply of fossil fuels, which I guess you would see as being different than the OPEC plus arrangement.
Call it OPEC plus.
Okay, so could one envision other producers beyond those currently engaged through OPEC and its relationship, for example, the Russian Federation? Halima, any thoughts on that?
One of the key challenges is that, U.S. producers, their independence. WICPARI cannot compel, pioneer natural resources to cut production in a way similar to, you could argue, the CEO of Rosneft may not have liked the agreement, but if Vladimir Putin tells him to sit down his barrels, I don't think anyone's going to challenge the authority of Vladimir Putin in terms of determining a production strategy that Russian, corporates are going to have to implement. The challenge is the U.S. energy sector is just so different. There's no convening mechanism. That said, I give Secretary Barkindo credit that he does seek meetings with U.S. producers. They do seek to have some type of dialogue, but the idea that you could ever really have the U.S. formally join those discussions, I think is, that's not going to happen.
All right, so we have I'm going to cut off the line behind the last gentleman there of the three, and I'd like to take the first two together, so please keep your question quite short, if you would.
Energy Mentors, my name is Gabriel Avgerinos. We are educators and consultants. We've talked about transition, but one thing that I'd like to phrase for my question is it's a transition from large carbon footprint to smaller carbon to zero carbon, which puts us into a question for the panel. I have not heard the word natural gas. In the transition towards cleaner fuels, the demand for natural gas is double what it has been for oil. The fungibility of gas markets has become a reality with LNG. Several countries in the Middle East have large gas deposits, and they have monetized them into liquefaction and to LNG exports. My question to you is, how do you balance the shifting mix from a demand point of view of less oil and more gas demand as we're going towards renewables, because that's going to be impacted by fracking in the United States, which is bringing more US, and more than likely in other countries where you are going to have fracking.
Okay.
Thank you.
And the next question, please.
My name is Nikola Lachonsky. I'm with Point State Capital. We're an investment firm here in New York. My question is a hypothetical one about the oil markets over the next 12 months. In particular, it's for our guests from the Gulf as to how you would advise your oil ministers in this hypothetical scenario. Let's assume that hypothetically, at $60 to $65 crude, we incentivize way more U.S. shale production growth than the global market can handle. And you're sitting around the table on November 30th late 2017, late 2018 at the OPEC meeting, trying to figure out what you're going to do with your barrels in 2019. Do you bring them back? Do you keep them offline? If you bring them back, the world doesn't need those barrels because at these prices, the U.S. is growing 1.5 plus. If you keep them offline, you can sustain prices 60 to 65, but you might have to cut again a year later because you've just incentivized another 1.5 of U.S. shale growth. So you have two choices. You either bring barrels back, have a $10 to $15 price sell-off, or you keep your barrels offline, keep things going at this elevated price range, but you lose market share. How would you advise your oil ministers if that were hypothetically where we were in late 2018?
Great, thank you. And actually, sir, if you don't mind, I will take your question as well, and then we'll do a wrap-up round.
Kind of a really quick question. Just curious as to what people are thinking about U.S. economic policy and its impact on some of the Gulf Coast countries that have their currencies pegged to the dollar. So if rates are going up here, kind of how does this complicate the whole picture for the Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, as they continue to think about reform and how to diversify their economy?
Good. So in reverse order then, the questions had to do with U.S. monetary policy and implications thereof for those countries in the Gulf Arab states that have pegs to the dollar. The question before that was, how does one advise ministers in November of 18 to reduce production or to sustain a lower level of oil price? And the first question was role of natural gas as one sees the transition to a lower and then no carbon future. So let's use this. Please, panelists, jump in on any and all of these, and we'll use this as a kind of a wrap-up round. Who would like to jump in first, please?
I'll start with the question of the gas. The question of gas, whether we are talking about electricity generation or transportation, at the moment, gas is the dominant fuel for electricity generation. For example, in UAE, 98% of the electricity is being generated by gas. And even in the country, we're still using heavy fuel and diesel. They are in the process of shifting to gas. Gas always will be there, and UAE Energy Policy 2050, gas will still there, representing 38% of the energy mix. The reason why? Gas is providing stability for the network. You cannot rely 100% on renewable unless storage technologies become accessible and can be installed at a competitive price. So gas always will be there. Situation completely different when you go into transportation. Transportation is still a sector that's being dominated by gasoline. We're still seeing some sort of introduction of entry of gas, but still introduction from gas and EV and hydrogen also, but still gasoline is the dominant part, and it continues to be so for the 20 or 30 years to come. So,
okay. Dr. Adnan, do you want to jump in on either the economic question, the peg to the dollar, the hypothetical of how to advise ministers,
Let me take the last one, the easy one.
Okay.
I think my advice would depend whether the market is balanced or not balanced. If the market is balanced, I will tell them to keep the policy where it is. If it's more supply, I will ask them to cut. And if it is short, I will ask them to increase. Because to me, what matters for the oil-producing countries and for the consumer is to have a steady price regime within $10, $20, because that gives confidence to everybody. So that would be my advice.
Excellent. Nabil, please.
Hi. I'm sorry, could you repeat the last one? The last question?
in the order that they were posed, the first question was role of natural gas on the way to a low and then no carbon future. The second question was how to advise one's minister if one found in November of 2018 a softening oil price. And the third was about the implications for the Gulf Arab states of U.S. monetary policy, particularly for those with a peg to the dollar.
I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that last one. It's obviously a professional economist's question. But the U.S. monetary policy has changed dramatically over the last 50 years, and the entire time, actually, Saudi Arabia, at least, and UAE have always pegged their currency to the dollar, regardless of where U.S. monetary policy went, simply because their income is spent in dollars. Most of their imports are imported in dollars, even when they come in the East, from the East. So regardless of what American monetary policy goes, at the end of the day, it'd be very complicated for them to switch away. As long as oil is priced in dollars, they're gonna stick with the dollar.
Great, thank you. Halima, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I would just add that given the heavy dependence on imports, the inflationary effects of breaking the peg or adjusting the peg, I think would be something that leaders would not want to go down that path right now. And I think there was this great report, I wish I could remember the name of the former senior SAMA official at the Kennedy School, who wrote this report saying that we need to do this transition. We need to create real sovereign wealth funds in Saudi Arabia and bring in binding fiscal rules that you get when you have a sovereign wealth fund, because we want to be able to maintain this peg. And if we burn through our reserves at such a fast pace, we won't be able to maintain something which is very important for social stability as well as economic stability. So I actually think that maintaining the peg is a very important policy priority for these governments, and I don't see any desire or indication that policy will change in the near future.
All right, and Bernie, last but not least, do you have any points you want to come in on, or parting shots?
I mean, I think mostly answered. I think the issue of the peg is that, again, most imports are in dollars, so it would have the effect of creating inflation and essentially pauperizing the population. So there are political implications. And it would be something that they would consider, but not immediately, I don't think.
All right.
Not with the reserves that they have.
And again, as I mentioned, remember that U.S. monetary policy has shifted dramatically in the last 15 years. First, it was based on the gold standard. Then there was a huge inflation in the 70s. Then the deflation of the 80s, and then so regardless of where it went, the peg remained. And that's a good indication of where it's going to stay.
Well, thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of a number of great events that we are hosting in the coming weeks at the Center on Global Energy Policy. I want to take advantage of your being here to call your attention to a couple more. On March 19th, we will have a program. It's one of our series called Where Next on Climate. It will look at responses from America's corporate boardrooms to the climate change issue. That's March 19th. On March 27th, we will have a book talk by Dr. Varun Sivaram, who has just released the book entitled Taming the Sun, Innovations to Harness Solar Energy and Save the Planet. And then last but not least, on April 19th, we will have our annual Columbia Global Energy Summit, which will have headliners from really an impressive list of very diverse headliners from around the globe. We will have the Secretary General of OPEC, His Excellency Mohammed Barkindo, Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, Dan Yergin from IHS Markit, the former Deputy National Security Advisor Avril Haines, the current Deputy Secretary of Energy of the United States, Dan Briette, from India's Energy and Resource Institute, Dr. Ajay Mathur, the CEO of ConocoPhillips, Ryan Lance, and the CEO of a major electric bus manufacturer here in the United States called Proterra, Mr. Ryan Popple. So I know many of you here have had the experience of climbing on airplanes and then climbing off somewhere 8, 10 hours, time zones different, and all the wonderful petri dish effects that one has in an airplane. I want especially to thank, therefore, our visitors from UAE, from Kuwait, and from Saudi Arabia. No less, I want to thank Halima and Bernie from closer at hand. Will you please join me in expressing appreciation to our panel?